I just want to say a little bit about Consumer Action. We are based in San Francisco with offices in Los Angeles and also in Washington, D.C. Irene's, in fact, on our board. But we work through a national network of some 8,000 community-based organizations. We work at the national level in terms of telecommunications, banking, insurance, housing. We also do multilingual educational work through our network with some more than 30 educational modules that we produce and distribute in 5 languages. We have worked on educational efforts around telecommunications since 1980. So we've gone through, seen a lot of changes taking place in the industry. One of our challenges, and one of the things I'll touch on a little bit in a few minutes, is that consumers are always very confused in terms of what's happening in terms of telecommunications, how to make intelligent choices, how to avoid being ripped off. And I think that's going to be increasingly an issue as we move forward. I think that one of the things that's happening in terms of telecommunications is a sharp reduction in the number of and the percent of people who have landline phone service. And the people who have cell phone or voice over IP are increasing very rapidly. Depending on the survey, between 35 and 40% of households no longer have landline phone service, with additional 15 to 20% that still have landlines but use their cell phones for virtually all their calls. These percentages will climb rapidly as most younger adults never considered having a landline. The shift away from landlines has created financial problems for legacy telephone companies as they have to cover the landline infrastructure costs with sharply reduced numbers of landline customers. These companies have focused on the changes to argue before the FCC and state regulatory legislators and regulatory agencies that they need relief from traditional regulations such as service quality, having to seek approval for rate hikes, and so forth. The shift to providing phone service over the internet is an even larger problem. IP-based telephone services do not fall under existing or clear regulatory frameworks. So let me step back for a second. I think what's happening is certainly people who have voice over IP sort of know how that works in terms, or they may not know how it works, but they know they can use it for their phone calls. It ends up being going by data packets as opposed to the traditional way in terms of voice going over wires. And then the other thing in terms of one of the real issues, and then the other, in addition to the landline service and VoIP, people are also getting phone service from wireless, which is far greater than ever has been before, and also through cable companies. The shift to phone service over the internet has created an even larger problem. IP-based telephone services do not fall under any existing or clear regulatory framework. As such, we have to start virtually from scratch to create regulatory safeguards for our consumers.
Okay,
Sure.
Well, maybe that may be a good point there to have Irene, and again, Irene, I'm going to remind you, you have to speak really loud, to talk about, so what you sort of described is that we've had this technology, we're changing and shifting to a new one. Irene, do you want to talk about what were the consumer protections that exist for traditional, the traditional delivery platform or the legacy platform for these services that we need to be keeping in mind as we move to the IP transition?
Okay. I'm glad to be with you all today, and in addition to my work with the Consumer Federation of America, I work with Virginia Citizens Consumer Council, which is a statewide grassroots group in Virginia. And as Virginia has gone through the process of deregulating our telecommunications, That's something that I've been involved with over the last however many years. I also happen to live in a very rural part of the state. I teach consumer studies at Virginia Tech, but I live 13 miles out of town, and I can't get a good internet signal out there. And the solution that they've told me is for me to move and go somewhere else. Also work with a family farm in the central part of the state, and there we have trouble as well. So, my husband has a condo in Crystal City because he works up in the D.C. area regularly, and we've played the Can You Hear Me Now game in that old condo building that doesn't have very good connection either. So as I've dealt with all of these things, and as we think about what consumers need, and as we look at an environment where folks want to deregulate and let the market deal with what we get, consumers still have frustrations. One of them is, where can I go complain beyond the company itself? Many times that doesn't solve things, and consumers need someone that can interact with the company and the consumer. And so that's where we need somebody like we currently have in state government in places where telecommunications are still regulated.
Okay, Irene, let me actually, maybe that's a good segue, because let's have Chairman Brisset talk about, so at the state level, for those of you who were here, or actually for those of you who weren't here on Monday, one of the things that Gary Resnick, was one of the panelists who was speaking, mentioned is that in Florida, there is no carrier of last resort. So it came up and said, well, if I build a development and I want to have phone service, there is nobody who's actually required to do it. And it just, because the argument is that the market would just solve that. And the question came up with, well, if I was one of those people for the market didn't solve it, who do I go to talk about? So can you talk about maybe what Florida, or what in general the state regulatory groups are doing?
Sure, thank you very much, and my pleasure to be here with you all this morning. So this conversation begins at the legislature, right, for states. And the legislature then arrives at the conclusion based upon the information that they gather from those who speak the loudest to them and speak in language that they understand, which includes cash or checks, and those who have the ability to lobby at that level. So in Florida, what began as a process maybe 10 or 12 years ago finally culminated 2 years ago, where in essence all of the regulatory structure in telecom has been removed from the authority of the Public Service Commission, except for arbitration of contracts between carriers. So therefore, in many cases, when individuals who have complaints, whether they're not able to receive service or the service is poor, quality of service type issues, they can't call our agency to do so. But the legislature, in their infinite wisdom, decided that they would transfer the function of consumer complaints to the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, which in theory is a catch-all for all sort of complaints. So if you have a complaint with your grocery store, you would call there, and if you have a complaint with your telephone service, you would also call there. So that individual who's receiving the call is supposed to be able to manage that range of issues. Now, to give some credit to the legislature, we had a year of training for those who are in the agency. One of the challenges that exists, obviously, is that if your function is primarily to accept complaints, there's nothing else that you can do to sort of support the resolution of that particular complaint. So that's one of the challenges that exists. So more than half of the states have moved to a deregulatory model where you have much less regulation with respect to these things. And so it varies in terms of how the regulation occurs. Some states, you have complaints that are taken in by the commission, and they can't do anything about it. You have some that actually still have the ability to address some of those issues. But for the most part, the complaints on a variety of issues have now been moved from the agency that was typically the agency that would deal with those issues to other agencies in the name of efficiency. So part of the challenge that we as states are grappling with, particularly commissions, is how do we engage in a world that we are not the primary player in compliance with or dealing with the issues that our consumers are facing. So part of that discussion we had at NARUC, was the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, and we created a task force to look at some of these issues and came up with some principles that, independent of who would be regulating or dealing with these issues, these are some of the issues that you need to keep in mind and ensure that they can handle these issues if these things are going to be transferred to other entities.
Okay, well, so then let's drill down a little bit with that, and let me ask Core. We've kind of got a bifurcated, federated, siloed structure. You've got federal, you got state. You are in a state in which you still have local cable regulation. It's not a statewide franchise state. How well you, I guess, have the benefit of you're still regulating the cable operator, you're still taking complaints. How well is this working?
I'd say for complaints that deal with the traditional cable company, I think it's worked relatively well. Having said that, even ignoring the IP transition, the system that we have set up because of the silo, because you have the states and the FCC and the states regulating telephone service, the FCC and local governments regulating, quote, cable service, and nobody regulating or having authority over internet service. The consumers are very confused and in many cases, have no idea where to go. If it's a service that is provided by the cable company, I get the phone call, or my office gets the phone call, and I'm sure most of you are the same way. And we take it, whether it's phone or internet, we get it to the cable company, and they try to resolve it. I know from personal experience that if you have a problem with your cell phone, good luck, because there's nobody out there who's going to be able to help you. And there are billing issues, and there are all kinds of issues that come up. In our state, if you have a telephone complaint, it is simply not clear. And I come from a state that is relatively well managed and has a relatively good state administrative system, but you don't go to the Public Utilities Commission. You may end up at the Department of Commerce. You may end up at the Attorney General's office. But there's not a clear path for people who have complaints outside of the cable system as to where they go.
Okay.
And I think that's been a huge issue up to this point. It's going to continue to get worse with the IP transition.
So let me ask Irene then, if one is, so we've identified the key problem is people just don't know where, and there's nobody who's specifically charged with addressing those complaints. Irene, substantively, you mentioned the ability to get service. Are there any other key issues that if we were sort of looking at this, that these are the beyond where do you go, how do I get service, what are the other key issues we want to be thinking of as part of the package of core customer service principles?
We also want to be sure that consumers get complete, concise, understandable information about what it is that they're getting, so that they know what they have and know that they are using what they have. And we need to have standards for billing and what happens when there are errors with billing and when there are problems with paying for things. There needs to be some way that those kind of things can be resolved. But getting information that's understandable, being able to get in touch with someone when there are problems with service, when there are issues of understanding the product that's provided and what the price is, those are some of the key things that I think we need to be concerned about.
Let me jump in on that. One of the things I think is really fascinating and very scary. AT&T is sort of rolling out their wireless home phone service, in which you which connects wirelessly to your cell phone. They're promoting it in a way that I find to be very deceptive. I mean, for example, they can say that you can add that line to your family's bundle of cell phone services, and that only costs $9.99. Or you can have a nationwide free service for $19.99. What they don't say is that if you choose the $9.99 choice, what will happen is you're going to be charged for incoming calls as well as outgoing calls. Also, in the very, very small mouse print, they admit that you may have problems with 911 and have to give your address if there's an emergency. They admit that you may not be able to get DSL. They admit that you're going to have problems with their DVR and satellite service, as well as home security services, home answering machines. That's all buried on the last page in very, very small print. And this is the sort of thing, as Irene mentioned, where we really need to educate consumers as well as force the regulators and the carriers themselves to be really upfront and transparent with consumers.
So then let me sort of throw a little curve in here. You have clearly there are problems. They are starting to emerge, and as you move through the IP transition, they will get bigger. How do you change this dynamic of nobody's handling this?
I think it's a political issue. And it will be easy for us to say, and I think we could all come up with a scheme that kind of made some sense with the Fed setting some standards and the states and the local people having some responsibilities for enforcement. The challenge is that the industries have sold the mantra that competition is going to solve all those problems, that the market will take care of them. And the reality is that the market is not taking care of them and will likely not take care of them. Whether it's phone service, internet service, or cable television or multi-channel video services, there really are only 2 or 3 providers in large cities. And in small cities and small rural areas, there's usually only one. And on top of the fact that once you've committed yourself to a provider with your internet, your phone, it's hard, it's time-consuming and complicated to change to a new provider. So it's not like walking into a grocery store and having a rack full of different bread products available for you, and you can pick one or the other. It's not an easy market, and it's not an easy market even for those of us who kind of know what's going on. So I think it's not probably going to change until there are enough consumers who are calling their legislators and saying, I'm pissed off, fix this problem.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I will agree with that for the most part. I think there's a couple other components that play into that, and that's some of them are definitional, right? I mean, what do we define as a telecommunication service, versus what we know as wireline service and so forth, and then who truly has jurisdiction over that and all of that. So then that creates some of this gray area as to who should really be the one regulating. Now, we have moved, as we are continuing to move into the IP or to that platform, in essence, that is now providing the service that was provided under a different type of platform that has now moved everything, in essence, in theory, to the FCC. And so then the question is, does the FCC have the resource to then police all of these things? And that's one of the questions that arise. The other thing I would say, and I would agree that this is a completely political problem that can be solved through that process, and that is by ensuring that people who are making decisions have the appropriate information before them to make those decisions. I served in the legislature, and I recall in one of the steps through the deregulatory process, the only information that we were getting was from the companies. So we were not getting substantial information from those who had a different approach. And so when you look at it, if you're not a legislator that comes from this area, you do not even think about some of the challenges that exist. Because if you're a legislator coming from a big city, I don't have a problem with my cell service, or if I have if I use voice over IP. I don't have those type of issues. So that is an issue that I think all of us in this room, as I believe at some point there is going to be some sort of shift, because the public is going to react at some point when the endless chain of, well, if you want to speak to somebody, dial 3, and then you're moved to, then you have to dial 5, and then you're back to dialing 3 again, and so forth. And so then the public is going to get to a point that they are going to react, and we have to, those who are interested in having somebody be the backstop to address some of these issues, have to be armed with the data and information that is necessary for decision makers to actually make solid decisions.
Irene, you want to jump in? Irene?
Oh, you got to speak into your computer, maybe.
Irene? Can you hear us, Irene?
No, I'm not hearing you much at all. I wanted to say that I think what's got to happen is that consumers have got to get very angry, angry enough that they decide to take action and involve other consumers. And I'm afraid that that's the only way that we're going to see change from the kinds of problems that we've got set up right now.
Okay.
I mean, I guess, I agree with Irene and Ron. I am very pessimistic. I mean, if in fact already half the states have moved to a deregulatory model, and for example, the FCC does a very poor job, a non-existent job of educating consumers in terms of their rights. Their call center is terrible. It's exactly what you were talking about in terms of you push this, push that, push that. They don't even have a separate number for phone complaints. And so I think what happens is that the legislators and the regulatory agencies either aren't hearing consumer complaints or have set up a process where they don't get them. And so I think it's, I agree that it's only going to be with, pushing for change. I am really baffled in terms of how to bring that about.
Well, let me ask you, are you, and Irene, if you can hear us, are you collecting data core at the local or at the state level? Are people actually, collecting statistics about the complaints, even the ones that you can't handle?
Often not. Until very recently in Virginia, our state regulator was prohibited from even collecting complaints about wireless, for example. And so when you get into the realm of these bundles, basically what the companies are saying is that no, you shouldn't do that. So it will probably fall to consumer groups to start trying to do that. And so far, most consumers are so frustrated and have so many other things going on that they're not really focusing on this and putting the kind of emphasis on it that will be required to make something change.
You know, I will say that those of us at the local level, for the most part, do collect data. Again, it's going to be limited to the company that we work with. Having said that, even with the current regulatory structure, and I'm just speculating, so those of you who do actually have a law degree can correct me, but it still seems to me that one of the things, because we can do this in many cases at the local level, is to set up some sort of Bill of Rights or some sort of consumer protection law that addresses things like transparency in billing across the board, that addresses clarity in providing information, answering the phone promptly, those kinds of things. And even without the federal government, as long as I think at the state level, the state should be able to set up a consumer protection law that applies across the board to all telecommunications companies. Then it falls to us, both at the local level and for consumers, to get the information and to lobby, if you will, the state legislators to make that happen. So if I'm completely off the mark, I'm willing to accept that, but it just seems to me to say we can't do anything is defeatist, and I'd like to think that there is at least something we could do.
Well, let me ask you this then. One issue that you often have with, I think probably at the local level, is that people have a problem, but maybe 1 out of 10 actually complain. Some of them, and then you take that and they'll go to the phone company or the cable company first, and then if they don't have it, then they might call you, and again, it kind of filters down. So one question would be, and let me ask Chairman Brisset, because you served in a state legislature. If you did surveys, valid, statistically viable surveys, and you did them around what Cora mentioned, these principles, do you feel your bill is transparent? Do you ever have a billing problem? On those types of things, would that be enough to move the temperature of a legislature, particularly in a state where you've already opted to deregulate?
Sure. I think that would move the needle a little bit. One, it would start the conversation. The fact that people have been engaged or are being engaged on those issues would make it a piece of the conversation with whomever is either running for office or is their current legislator. That if it's not something that's on their radar, they won't bring it up. But if they have to cognitively address this issue, it would be something that they would bring up. And it's something that the legislator would then maybe look at again. But I'll just talk about those numbers. Just for, my state has about 20 million people, right? And for wireline complaints, between first and second quarter, we had 76,000. Okay?
When you say that, do you think that's a high number or a low number?
I'm saying that with the number of the people that live in my state, I would think that that's probably a low number.
Okay.
Right? For wireless, 90,000 complaints. And for bundled service, about 3,800 or so complaints. So part of the challenge, and this is part of the challenge that exists, is that because people may not know where to go, these numbers are what they are, right? And the second thing may be is that when people do call, they don't achieve what they were hoping to achieve. So therefore, people don't call to the agency or whoever it may be to receive that type of help. So that is something that we have to address. And I think that this is one of these things that, as government, we have to address it from the bottom all the way to the top. What I mean by that is that the state has to work with the local governments in doing that, as well with the federal government to do that. I personally believe that the states are probably in the best position to address some of these issues because the resources there, and you have a broader view of the state. So therefore, you can tell who's a bad actor in one part of the state versus another part of the state and all of that. But that takes a true spirit of cooperation amongst all the levels of government towards a particular common goal.
Ken?
Yeah, another issue in terms of tallying complaints. Consumer Action for decades has handled complaints in English, Cantonese, Mandarin, and Spanish. We are very unique in that respect, particularly most regulatory agencies don't. What that means is that people who are doing scams, I mean, whether it's selling internet service or cell phone services or iPhones, they know that they can go under the regulatory radar if they do it in languages other than English. Recently, we uncovered a massive scam in San Francisco's Chinatown, in which they set up a storefront saying that they were AT&T, had people come in, order 5 iPhones, were told not to open the boxes but to bring them back. The company then sold the iPhones to other people, saddling the consumer with 2-year service plans. These consumers had no place to go except to Consumer Action. We then bundled the complaints together and complained to AT&T and got the charges removed. But I think with shifting demographics in the nation, this adds another complexity in terms of making sure that we amass the complaints that we need for change.
So, Ken, let me just stay with you for a minute and say, if I was the industry, and we had some people from the industry here on Monday, and they would say, what would they point to and say, well, the fact that you have low complaints means that the marketplace is working, right?
Yeah, but I think we've touched on that. For example, until very recently, and I don't know how recently, the FCC was primarily handling complaints in English. They had one person who was handling Spanish language complaints. When she went on maternity leave, there were none. But I think that the industry, by being able to keep resources down for regulatory agencies, both in terms of call centers, people who investigate complaints, and also educational materials, what they're able to do is really depress the number of complaints that come in. And then they can point to that in terms of saying that there's no problem. We see the same problem in terms of the federal regulatory agencies who say, oh, we don't have complaints, therefore we don't need to take action. I mean, so it ends up being a real catch-22 and a real challenge in terms of getting the complaints to the regulators so that they will be forced to take some action.
So, okay, so let's explore a different model then. In several states, they have a ratepayer advocate, right? So particularly where you have regulated traditional telephone POTS service, there's somebody who comes and says, well, on behalf of consumers, I'm making an argument. Would it make sense, would it be viable if at the federal level, at the FCC, if you created an Office of Consumer Advocate, because I'm trying to understand is, Ron, you sort of said that the state may be the right place to have some of that enforcement. I'm curious, Cora, what you think about that, and do you think that it's viable to break the sort of captured agency syndrome if you could create that kind of consumer advocate? And Irene, did you want to jump in?
I think that would be a great idea, and it could possibly work. I think we're going to still need things at the state level, but definitely we need to try a model like that to see if that would help.
I guess my position would be is that the FCC and the federal government are more appropriate in setting sort of overall standards. I do think that a lot of this can and should be handled at the state level, with the exception that some cities in our communities, it may be Minneapolis and St. Paul, and I look at Tony Perez because the city of Seattle has a very good consumer protection, customer bill of rights for telecommunications. That cities could opt in or opt out of state protection. There are also very small towns where they're simply not going to have that ability. So having sort of a state system or state office that handles the enforcement of standards with the ability of larger communities or smaller communities to either opt in or opt out. The challenge, frankly, is how do you fund that? Where does that money come from? And again, and people complain about all kinds of fees, but I think that folks would be willing to have a 50-cent fee or a small fee added to their bill if they knew that there was going to be somebody that they could call when there was a billing issue, when there was confusion, if they couldn't solve a problem with whoever their provider is. And I think that's the issue. It's not, we need to look at these services across the board and not, you talked about the numbers, and individually, in your mind, they're not very big, but if you tally them all together, that's 500,000 people who are having problems with their providers. And that's, I don't think, insignificant. And from the provider's standpoint, I think they want to know about those complaints. I think when we send something to our provider, it's helpful for them to know that somebody was getting incorrect information from a customer service rep, or that there's a technical issue in a particular community. I think they need to know that. So it doesn't necessarily have to be an adversarial relationship. It's an information sharing relationship, and it's giving those consumers some feeling that somebody's going to listen to them if they have a problem.
And I will say that for those of you who weren't here on Monday, that the representative from CTIA did say the same thing, that they were interested in getting that information back. Ken, do you want to talk? You're in California. California set up several things at the state level. How well do you think that state enforcement is working?
It's a constant struggle. I also chair the Universal Telephone Service Administrative Committee. And several years ago, we were able to get a small fee added to the surcharge to support Lifeline phone service. So we actually provide through the state, several $1 million a year in terms of Lifeline education, outreach, advertising, and things like that. And sort of a centralized database in terms of making sure that folks don't get more than one, Lifeline phone service. There's also a division of ratepayer advocates, which is very effective. But I think there's also something that's very unique in California, which is intervener funding, in the sense that consumer groups who participate in regulatory proceedings and make a quote-unquote significant contribution to the results of those proceedings get reimbursed for the costs that they had in terms of providing that for lawyers, auditors, and things like that. What's interesting about that is that in California, we have both ratepayer advocate division, but also intervener funding. So I think that we end up being more effective than in other parts of the country, but it's still an uphill battle. For example, we've been struggling with the commission for years and years in terms of setting up a good complaint mechanism, a complaint database. One of the things that I find most maddening is that the California PUC relies on consumer action for the educational materials that they distribute to consumers. And about a decade ago, we did a very comprehensive telephone users guide, several hundred pages. The biggest order went to the commission for their call center because they didn't have anything else other than the tariff sheets. So even when you do a really great job, I think we do, there's still some gaps. So I think there really needs to be pressure brought, across the board in terms of particularly, making sure that there is education, making sure there are adequate complaint handling, and that the data is, compiled in such a way that provides help for the regulators. Oh, and we just defeated a bill in the California legislature, which would have gutted the Lifeline. So there is some hope out there.
So I'm going to jump in. I go back to one of the questions that you asked Ken about if you're in the industry, what would you say? I suppose if you're industry, you would say, one, some of the things that you all are talking about in terms of consumer protections, well, we've put out the equivalent of a customer's bill of rights, right? CTIA will tell you that they've done that. Then they will say, you don't regulate my rates, so then how can you regulate my quality of service if you don't regulate my rates? And so then the question is, why don't you regulate my rates? Well, because the rates are so low that there's no need for you to regulate my rates, and competition is as such so that you don't need to do so. So that's part of the challenge that exists, and when you talk to a legislator, that's what the legislator is hearing, in terms of looking at this issue broadly. In terms of the consumer advocate, when we were in a position to regulate, that was very helpful, because when a company would come before the commission with a rate case or whatever it is, one of the things that the consumer advocate would stand very strongly on is to say, look, why should you get any more if you can't provide the service? So you have to justify, what you're asking for. And so we find that in electric cases and water cases and gas cases that we're dealing with. But it's helpful that you have something to regulate in order to give you some of that leverage that you need. And I think that's part of the major challenge that exists as we move into this deregulatory model.
So do you think it's possible to ask for, there's, particularly in states where they've already deregulated, there is no political will to come back and say, let's regulate the rates of wireless services, or even potentially, you can tell me whether you think for broadband, IP, VoIP services, but if there isn't will to regulate those rates, could you reach a compromise where you at least have to provide, you have to provide the information that you would have to provide in a rate-regulated setting, but there's nobody arbitrating, it's more of a disclosure?
Right. And that happens in my state. In terms of rates and things of that nature.
Does it happen for more than wireline telephone?
It happens, no, it's only for wireline, nothing beyond wireline.
And do you see anybody's willingness to extend that beyond wireline?
I think if the appropriate people in the state expressed that was something of interest to them, that could probably happen. So
Irene and Ken, is it possible to rile up consumers? Is there a clamoring, or is it a matter of you just don't know until you don't have it?
I would say that it's something that's going to take a while to come to be. And there are just so many things that consumers are struggling with in today's marketplace that there probably is going to come a point when they'll overflow and decide that something's got to happen with this and some other things where, consumers in many cases today have to just accept whatever a company will give them. And there are limited ways that consumers can end up getting help or even from the courts these days with all the arbitration clauses that are in our contracts. So at some point, I think we're going to get to a situation where consumers are so frustrated that they will do something. But I think it's going to take a while.
Yeah, I think I would agree. As I mentioned before, we were able to, with a lot of other consumer and the community groups and also consumers complaining, we were able to defeat a Lifeline gutting bill in California that would have increased rates and basically deregulated Lifeline in the state. So I think if there are specific issues where you can rally people around, and I think we're doing the same thing right now at the federal level in terms of Lifeline with the attacks that are coming on it. But I think it has to be framed in such a way that consumers understand it. I mean, for example, we did a push to get signatures on a petition that would be sent to congressional bodies in Washington, basically saying that Lifeline should not be gutted, that you shouldn't eliminate wireless Lifeline. We were able to get 1,600 signatures. I don't know, and other groups are doing the same thing. So I think that the point here, I think, is that you have to choose your battles. You have to frame the battles in a very specific way. And by doing that, I think you can mobilize both community-based organizations and also individual consumers. But I think that, as Irene said, there's so much frustration out there that consumers don't know where to turn, so it needs to be a focused approach.
So, well, let's just follow up on that. If you were going to pick your battle, if you had, okay, the FCC is willing to take a meeting with you, or the state legislature is willing to take a meeting with you, these are my top two issues that I think that consumers care about the most. What are they?
Well, I will say that consumers want a place that they can call and they're going to get a result. And so whether it's at the commission or some other agency within the state or whatnot, but an entity that can actually get the result that the person is looking for. The second thing is, so that first thing includes billing complaints and all of that, quality of service and all those type of things. The second thing I would say is, from a broader perspective, is interconnection. Ensuring that there is adequate interconnection agreements across the nation so that when I call from Miami, Florida, and I call to a rural part of Florida or a rural part of the United States, that I'm not in a loop because, it's just not financially viable for that call to go through at the rate that I'm calling from in Miami. So I think those are the two things that I would be concerned about.
Cora?
It seems to me that based on what I hear from customers is there's two areas that they have a lot of complaints about. And while billing is certainly up there, billing kind of gets back to the transparency of the rates that they're charging. As the offerings become more proliferate, and the companies are attempting to get more customers, they have all these special deals, and it's as confusing to order a service from the cable provider these days as it is to to find an airline ticket. It depends on what day you call and who you talk to. There are so many different offerings out there, and the pricing for those can vary, it seems like, from day to day. I think we heard on Monday that when it comes to bundling for the cable companies, there may be 100 or 200 different types of bundling packages that they have. And so that becomes very confusing, and it's, again, it's that lack of transparency. What are you paying for? What are you getting? And why is my neighbor next door getting something, a completely different price than what I am getting? So that transparency, and then having the service work the way that the consumer has been told it's going to work. And again, I know a lot of this is very technologically complex, but a lot of times they'll order something and it's just not working. And I think that folks want to know that it's going to work the way they've been told it's going to work. And those are the two big issues, the biggest issues. I mean, there's a variety of other complaints from burying cables or not burying cables, but I think those are the two big things that consumers would like to see.
Irene?
Consumers want complete, accurate, understandable, comparable information. And the second thing that consumers want is one place that they can go and get answers and not get sent around, well, it's not my jurisdiction, it's theirs, or one department to another. Those would be the two top things on my list.
Ken?
As I sort of said before, I think we need to sort of focus in on some specific battles. The two I would do would be cramming on cell phones. There was extensive cramming on landline phone services. There was a huge fight over it, a huge dispute, and basically the legacy carriers pulled back. I was scared of hitting it again.
No. Ken, will you just, when you say cramming, we just...
I'm sorry. That is sort of when third-party companies place bills on your phone bill. I mean, place charges on your phone bill. Often consumers did not authorize them, didn't know they were there, didn't know they were recurring. There was such a stink around cramming on landline phone services that the carriers stopped doing it. Now they want to shift to wireless. I think the same issues are there, and I think cramming is something that is one consumers get really angry about, plus the media loves it, just loves it. The other thing I think is in terms of marketing sales abuse. There was a great victory in California 10 years ago or so where Pacific Bell was like marketing things deceptively. Again, it's something that makes consumers angry, and the media loves it. And I think the third one, if I can stick in a third one, it would be sort of ignorance in terms of data charges on cell phones, which can result in very, very high charges. Again, something that makes consumers very mad, wanting to protest, and also has a lot of media bite to it. And I think that's what you need.
Okay, so one last big question, and then we'll open it up to if we've got some questions from the audience. So we've sort of discussed, these are the key issues, which really sort of do come down to sort of the transparency, having a place to call, reliability, interconnection, which remarkably mirror, for those of you who are on Monday, the principles of public knowledge, sort of put out there. The other one was public safety. But is it possible, if you are the intake body for complaints, you may enforce them, but you don't necessarily have authority to craft new standards? I mean, I think at the local level, a lot of cable regulators have had that issue of, we didn't set these rules, they called me about something, but I don't have any rule that addresses that. So is it really viable if you say enforcement will happen at the state level, maybe there's an opt-out, but the rules are set someplace else, whether it's the legislature or the FCC? Is that model viable? Or how viable is it? Or what do you need to make it viable?
Funding. I mean, I think that's the real issue. I mean, certainly what's happened across the country is there's been sharp reductions of funding for local protection agencies. In many cases, they've gone out of business. Sharp reduction in resources for state regulatory agencies. I think what's really needed at all levels is a sharp increase in funding. Without that funding, there won't be the staff, there won't be the resources to be able to work on these issues.
You know, I think it could work if we had an FCC and we had some state agencies that recognized that the public interest included all of the public and not just the companies. And we've had an FCC before that's done that, but we haven't had one in recent years. So again, I think it's possible, but again, it becomes political will and it's a political issue.
So I'll chime in and basically say that I think the structure is there to support that type of thing. We just need to use all the avenues. I mean, we have joint boards, we have advisory commissions to the FCC, which are supposed to take in some of these issues and so forth. And if we truly were to work cooperatively, and in some of these you have industry that are part of these commissions and so forth, and if we were to work collaboratively towards that end goal of recognizing that we all serve the same people. You may charge, and your job is to provide the service and make a profit. My job is to make sure that the playing field is leveled, and that the people who I am tasked to look out for their interests are receiving what they are entitled to receive at fair, just, and reasonable rates. And that if someone is charged to ensure that they protect the interests specifically of the consumer, that all of us work together to ensure that those things happen. So structurally, it's there. It's just a matter of us truly using the mechanisms to reach that end.
Irene?
The question, sorry, since I came here, I got lost.
So really the issue is how do you make the enforcement work if you don't necessarily have the same body creating rules as enforcing them?
That's a real challenge because you've got to go somewhere else to get the rules set. Then it's the mess that we've got right now. So I think that you need to give the entity that's enforcing some mechanism for being able to influence that entity that's setting the rules and to be able to make a difference. And they need some autonomy locally, and it needs to be backed up by the federal government. Because I'm assuming that's the entity that would end up making the rules. So if you don't back up the people who are enforcing, then it's not effective, and the companies still run havoc, and the consumer gets nothing.
All right, do we have any questions from the audience?
Pam Berrien, longtime Natoan, Eugene, Oregon. I'd like to have us think about bringing another partner to the table. I think the consumers are well represented by the agencies we have here, and we heard from AARP yesterday. For a long time, I've been following our state AG's top 10 list, and for as many years, I stopped counting. It's well over 10. Telecommunications has been in the top 10 list. I called the Public Utilities Commission, and from one state agency to the other, the staff I deal with at PUC aren't tracking the complaints that are going to the AG, so it's like, well, the complaints aren't coming to us. And But I think the consumers are complaining out there. I've also gone to other state lists for the state top 10. They're everywhere, all over the nation. And then I pulled up a site it's older, from 2008, but I bet it's more recent than this. There is the National Association of Attorney Generals. Maybe we need to start partnering with them, NATOA and others. In their top 10 list for '08, there were 3 telecommunications top 10 complaints. Number 4, internet goods and services. Number 7, telemarketing do not call. Number 9, telecom /slamming/cramming. So there is our partner right here, and maybe they can help us with the FCC because they'll have the data. Okay.
Any
No, I agree. Those are among the top complaints that we face as well, but it also talks about how divided the regulatory schema is now. I mean, in terms of, so for example, a separate issue on privacy. The FCC and the FTC are fighting over who should be regulating privacy on the telecommunications. I think what you mentioned, it talks about just in terms of how spread out regulatory efforts are and the importance in terms of being able to consolidate a lot of that so really the consumer knows where to turn.
Ronald, including the AGs, the Attorney Generals?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I think in most states, the Attorney General's office has the ability to play in the regulatory space anyway, because ultimately they protect the consumer. They're the ultimate protector of the consumer in the state. So a lot of times they have other things that they're concerned about, and that's not the primary thing that they're dealing with.
Gar?
Thank you. This is something I haven't thought about, but I'm Gar Clark, New Mexico. And first of all, thanks for the cramming. I had a guy call from a jail. I don't even know him. And the only person home was a dog, and evidently the answering machine answered. I had like a $600 and something bill, which for me to pull out of that was unfrickin' real. Went to bad credit, the whole shot. So that is a big deal. And I'm going to say the company is called Legacy. Don't deal with them. Class action suit, the whole shot, big deal. But one thing that I got thinking of is we have the Attorney General on one side of the fence, and we have the PRC on the other side of the fence, and they're hamstrung in different ways in order to provide advocacy for the consumer. So many of our states have there are state broadband initiatives, which has really created a holistic kind of a situation and relationship with the providers for planning as well as for the mapping, availability, and adoption programs and stuff. One of the things that we're doing in the state of New Mexico is we're looking at a business plan, like many states already have in place or are developing, for this public-private partnership, you know? And part of it is funding. Funding could come from a lot of different places. Could be the surcharge or what have you. But it's getting me to thinking that maybe a part of this not-for-profit entity could be the gathering of information, and also to the hub to bring in the Attorney General for enforcement of consumer complaints, but also bring in the PRC to do things that they can do. So those are just some thoughts, and I'm just wondering, you know, I'm sure this is not unique, but there might be some other parts and states where this entity is providing, because we're taking complaints now in a state broadband program, and then we're middleware between the consumer. We don't get in between them, but it's really about facilitating problem solving between the provider and the consumer. So what do you think about that?
So let me sort of parse out what that question is. So is the idea that you've got a state broadband initiative now, you're getting complaints, and you're trying to build a partnership with between the regulatory agencies to be, so you're an intake?
Yeah. In fact, we already have a relationship with our regulatory. They're on our executive committee. So So yes, sort of a complaint center that then doles out based upon.
Okay, so you're basically, so in a lot of ways, maybe the equivalent would be people who have a 311 center. I got a complaint, it comes to me, and you don't have to figure out what regulatory structure does it. I know that this is this complaint, and so it's going to go to the ag department, or it's going to go wherever. Thoughts on?
Formalize this into an office
So maybe the question
Yeah.
is, it may be easier rather than, because it takes time to change the state agencies, at least as an interim step, that there's one place for people to call who can help people figure out who can handle this.
No, I think that's a really good idea, and I think, as was mentioned, the 311 is a way of doing that. It's been more successful in some areas than others. Private groups like Consumer Action do that already in terms of accepting a wide range of complaints. But I think the other thing, it makes the educational effort much easier, because you could basically say, if you have a complaint, call this number. Mm-hmm. You don't have to, if you have a complaint about X, or the weight and the meat in your grocery store, or a cell phone complaint, you call here or there, it's one number, and I think that would really help. And I think that's a really good idea.
All right, in the interest of time, I want to say just on the cramming issue, we did invite Verizon, and they had a scheduling conflict. Just in full disclosure, what they would say is that on the wireless issue, that it is not as big a problem as it is on the wireline, because you are required affirmatively to say, I want this charge on my cell phone, and to pick in. There's some problems with it, but I just want to say that would be what their argument would be. I want to thank our panelists for coming. I think this has been a nice conversation. I hope that all of you enjoyed it as well, and it's nice to get at NATOA a nice perspective of people who do these things at the federal level, at the state level, and the local level. And with that, please thank our panelists. And I think it's time for lunch. Thank you, Irene.
Thank you.